This is Cleveland 19 News.
You'll remember it was November 10th when a private jet slammed into an apartment complex in Akron while on approach to the Akron-Fulton International Airport. The 2 pilots, 7 passengers, all died. They were all from Florida. Now the NTSA has opened up its investigation, and there are some alarming questions that need to be asked about the pilot and the co-pilot. First, let's start with the black box. The NTSB has given us the entire conversation that took place between the pilot and the co-pilot, or what's known as the officer and the first officer. Throughout the transcript in this black box, I've read every single word of it. There seems to be this confusion. What they call Hot 2 is the co-pilot or the first officer. And he's talking about what's the approach, what is the ground, where is the ground, 501, right? Now as the overcast is 800, there's just this running theme of confusion. And then let's get to, unfortunately, the last very few seconds. Right here, Hot 1, this is the pilot or the officer of the flight. He says on localizer, you're diving, don't dive, 2,000 feet per minute, buddy. And it's said with emphasis, they are going down too quickly. He knows it. He's giving out some other commands. And then, unfortunately, right here in the last seconds, you hear an oh, 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 and sound of a thunk. That is the crash. Now, with more on the pilot and the co-pilot themselves, let's get to Denise.
All right, Dan. Well, we have been poring over that NTSB report today, and here are some of the answers we're getting so far from that. The pilots had only flown together 3 times in the previous 90 days before the crash. Both pilots were hired by ExecuFlight in June of 2015. The pilot, Oscar Chavez Mosquera, was current and qualified under ExecuFlight and FAA requirements, but he had been fired from a previous employer in April of that year, just 7 months before the crash, for missing a training course on Hawker 800s. That's the same type of plane that crashed. And the co-pilot, Renato Marchese, was also fired 10 months before the crash for training issues with his previous employer, but he was also current and qualified under ExecuFlight and FAA requirements. Joining us now to talk about all this is Jamie Lebovitz, an aviation attorney. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, some glaring red flags in this report from the NTSB. What stands out to you?
Well, first of all, from the flight itself, 3 minutes before the actual crash took place, there were all the signs and indications that the co-pilot, who was actually flying the airplane, which is not unusual, was behind the aircraft, was not recognizing that his airspeed was decreasing too rapidly, and he was slowing an airplane down without the flaps being set. The flaps are devices at the trail end of the wings that increase the size of the wings so that you can have, aerodynamic lift at slower speeds. And so you could slow the aircraft down, which is appropriate to approach and land an airplane, but you have to configure the airplane or set it up so that it could maintain lift, and he didn't do that.
Yeah. So you see the pilot calling out, hey, you're not doing this, you're going too slow, we don't want to stall, we don't want to dive. Why doesn't the pilot just take over?
Well, the pilot should have. He had many opportunities to do so, at least, as I said, 3 minutes before, but the problems continued to get much worse as time passed. And what he should have said is, I've got the airplane. Those are the universal words that are used by pilots around the world, where it's recognized that the pilot flying the airplane is having difficulty for some reason or another. Now we know, after the fact, having seen the records of these 2 pilots, that their work history was less than stellar.
Well, let's talk about that. If you're a family member and you lost a loved one on this flight, I mean, the fact that both of these guys were fired recently for training problems and then hired by ExecuFlight, but they're cleared to fly? First of all, why would ExecuFlight hire them with this kind of problem in their history? And why would that happen? Why would they be allowed or cleared by the FAA?
The problem is much larger than this, Denise. There is a great shortage of pilots in the United States and even elsewhere. As pilots have retired, the more senior, seasoned pilots have retired, there are fewer and fewer pilots that are so-called qualified, to operate an aircraft. And so, the standards have diminished. And we're seeing it in this particular environment here for this particular flight.
In your legal expertise, when it comes down to it, what will be the final cause of this crash?
Well, the NTSB in the coming months will issue what is known as a probable cause report. And that essentially will be conclusions drawn by the National Transportation Safety Board, which consists of 5 people. And they will likely, based on the facts that we've seen so far today, determine that, that this plane crash occurred because of multiple errors and omissions committed by this flight crew, number one, in the conduct of this flight. But they'll go deeper than that. They'll look at the past history of both these pilots and the failure in the system to identify 2 pilots, both of whom had very poor records of flying experience, how they were hired and then put in charge of an aircraft such as this and the lives of people in their hands. And you're going to see, I think, a lot of discussion on that and questions pertaining to the shortage of pilots and the lack of good training. You know,
Our safety depends on it. So important. Yeah.
Pilots that are flying the commercial airliners, you know, like a major carrier, many of them come up with training through the military. And we're seeing fewer and fewer pilots with the military training. They're coming out of civilian programs, not all of which are the same.
Mr. Lebovitz, thank you much for your time, your expertise.
Appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. A lot of good insight here. Now, we've posted the entire NTSB report on our website. You can also read the report on Cleveland 19 News mobile app.
Now.